Hello, this is Jake, and this is what is hopefully the beginning of a series of deck building videos. For these deck building videos, I'm not looking on how to tell you to make a specific deck list, but rather I'm going to look at the commanders, and maybe sometimes look at other cards, and tell you how to creatively use those, all the different ways you can use those. Because I think it's important to be unique, and I think it's important that instead of handing you a deck list, that you make your own deck that fits your desires, your idea of fun, and your playgroup's idea of fun, and your playgroup's power level. And that's different for everyone, depending on your social needs, your budget needs, your competitive needs. And so that's kind of why I don't want to give a specific deck list, but I want to give you the creative tools to express yourself with your own deck list. For this first video, I thought I'd show off my favorite commander. This commander leads the kind of standard deck that I use. It's my favorite deck. I like to pull it out, especially in new playgroups, just to kind of get a vibe for things. And that commander is Rocco Street Chef. Rocco Street Chef costs 3 mana, 1 red, 1 green, 1 white. And says at the beginning of your next end step, each player exiles the top card of their library. Until your next end step, each player may play the card they exiled this way. They can do this, lands, spells, whatever it is. But because of the wording here, you have to do it the normal legal way. The only difference is instead of coming out of your hand, it comes out of exile. So you got to pay for it if it's a spell. If it's a land, you only get your 1 for turn, right? Things of that nature. But they do get that little bit of extra card advantage from you. The benefit to you here is whenever a player plays a land from exile or casts a spell from exile, and this is not just from Rocco. This is if something comes out of exile, played as a land, cast as a spell from any trigger, then you get to put a 1/1 counter on a creature of your choice and also make a food token. Another thing to note here is that creature does not have to be your own creature. There are some fun ways to make use of this that I want to discuss later. Food tokens as well, while being kind of the weakest of the trifecta of clues and foods and treasures, are still pretty useful. The power toughness here is nothing really to write home about. Although the 4 toughness is nice, it puts it out of lightning bolt range. The total power toughness puts it out of cut down range for anyone running that kind of removal that cares about those stats. So let's talk about the staples, the things that you look for with this deck. And what you look for should be rather obvious, but we'll cover it anyway. You're going to look for cards that give you 1/1 counters. 1/1 counters are nice. 1/1 counters are very common in Magic the Gathering. They give you good blockers. They give you good attackers. And while Rocco does put 1/1 counters on things, you're going to want to look for more sources of 1/1 counters. And maybe more importantly, you're going to look for payoffs for having those 1/1 counters on your creatures. Next thing you're going to look for is obviously cards that deal with the exile zone. You're going to want not cards that just put things into exile, but cards that let you and let other players get things back out of exile. Because it's not just you that Rocco cares about, it's when any player does something from exile. So you're going to want to find a balance of encouraging other players to use things from exile without giving them too much of an advantage as well. Cascade's a good way to do that. There's a bunch of other keyword mechanics and even card types that use the exile zone as part of their abilities. So look out for that. Obviously, also, you want to look out for food-related synergies. You want to look for cards that specifically mention foods. You want to look for cards that specifically mention tokens. And you want to look for cards that specifically mention artifacts or historic permanents. All these things, food can help you benefit from. Food's really good for synergy. And honestly, often you're not even sacrificing them to gain life. You're just using them for their type. So first, let's talk about counters and the different cards that feature 1/1 counters that are good for you. First card may be Generous Pup. Generous Pup says whenever you put a 1/1 counter on it, you get to put one on everything else you have. Only once a turn, but still a very good card for its cheap mana cost at 2 mana. And it helps you get more efficiency out of that 1/1 counter Rocco puts down. It's especially useful because you're not the only person playing cards from exile. Rocco does this to everyone. And so if anyone else is playing the card that Rocco gives them, you get an extra 1/1 counter as long as they're doing it on their turn or someone else's turn. That gives you a maximum of 4 1/1 counters on all your creatures just with this and your commander out. Another card you want to look at is Rosy Cotton. Rosy Cotton's a powerful piece, a combo piece even. Makes a food, which is nice and beneficial for the deck's theme. And also, whenever you make a token, whether it be a food token or a different token, you get to put a 1/1 counter on something as long as it isn't Rosy. This works really well with a lot of cards, lets you make infinite combos. One of those cards is Basking Broodscale. Basking Broodscale says you put a 1/1 counter on it and you make a Eldrazi spawn creature token. This creature token has no power, so it's not a good attacker, but it can help chump block, and more importantly, you can sacrifice it for mana. So when you make this creature token, it triggers Rosie, who triggers off of any token, and makes another 1/1 counter that you put on Broodscale, and you repeat that until you have as much mana as you want, as many Eldrazi spawn as you want, and a very large lizard. Another card you want to look at that's very nice is Evolution Witness. Evolution Witness says when one or more 1/1 counters are put on it, you get to take a permanent from your graveyard and put it back into your hand. This gives you some nice kind of resistance against removal, as whenever your creatures or your artifacts or your enchantments get removed, you can get them back with Evolution Witness just off of Rocco or Rosie or one of the other sources of 1/1 counters. It's very nice to be able to have that kind of resiliency. Although you have to be careful when you play Evolution Witness, because you want to get use out of it before someone thinks to remove it. Because once it's gone, it's a little more difficult to get back. Another card you want to look at is Kami of Whispering Hopes. This card fits two separate niches that are good for the deck. The first niche is that it increases the amount of 1/1 counters you get to put on things, which is always nice. Doubling Season and Hardened Scales, those are very nice stapley cards, and Kami of Whispered Hopes fills a similar niche, but it also fills the niche of giving you more mana. It adds mana equal to its power, and you get to keep making that power larger with all your 1/1 counter synergies. There are cards like Gyre Sage as well that do similar effects, but Kami does a little more, so that's what I decided to show off. You also have the option of Abzan Falconer. Abzan Falconer lets all your creatures with 1/1 counters on them have flying. That's useful both to defend against other opponents' flying creatures, as well as to get over people's non-flying creatures if you have a more aggressive game plan in mind. Speaking of aggressive game plans, the last 1/1 counter card I want to show off is Kodama of the West Tree, which says modified creatures you control have trample. Having a counter on your creature does make it modified, so all these creatures with 1/1 counters on them will have trample, and perhaps more importantly, if you get through combat damage with them, you get 2 ramp. You get to take a basic land card from your deck and put it onto the battlefield tapped, which really helps, once again, kind of accelerate your game plan, just like Kami, just like Basking Broodscale. Lots of good synergy pieces, and there's not really any game-ending pieces I showed off here, but that's mostly because you don't need them. 1/1 counters themselves can be game-ending with the flyers, with the tramplers, or anything like that. You just make a large creature or creatures and swing with them. Moving on, let's talk about the exile-related synergies you can have from the deck. I tend to lean into this harder than I do with the 1/1 counters personally, but it's up to you how you build your deck. The first card I want to look at is Party Thrasher. Party Thrasher gives your non-creature spells from exile Convoke, which means you can help pay for them by tapping your creatures, which helps accelerate your game plan, especially if you have some of the more powerful non-creature spells in your deck. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, it also lets you discard a card to exile the top 2 cards of your library. Then you can pick one of them and play that card this turn. So it gives you a little more ways to trigger Rocco and to trigger other cards that care about things coming out of exile. It's a nice, cheap piece to get out at 2 mana. As well, we have Savvy Trader. Savvy Trader is useful because it helps not only with your cards from exile, but also any commander tax you may have to pay due to your commander being removed. Savvy Trader lets you take a permanent from your graveyard and put it into exile and let you play it for as long as it remains exiled. And then spells you cast from anywhere other than your hand cost 1 less, so it helps a little bit with recursion and a lot with making the things you get from exile cheaper. Another card you want to look at is Memory Vessel. Memory Vessel is one of the kind of cards that interrupt your opponent's game plans by using the exile zone. What happens with Memory Vessel is you can tap it and exile it, and then each player will exile the top 7 cards of their library, and until your next turn, they can play those cards, but not the cards in hand. And then once your next turn hits, they can't play the cards exiled anymore, they're gone. So this is nice because they may have a good game plan in their hand, and you can make them take a full round off delayed from that game plan. You can give them extra cards, but those extra cards may not fit what they were planning on doing, and more importantly, if they don't use them, then they lose them once your turn hits again. So that means they are incentivized to play these cards from exile if they're good cards, and if they do, then that's going to synergize with all of your payoffs for them playing things from exile. It's a very good kind of disruptive piece that also benefits you. Another card you want to look at is Bigger on the Inside. Bigger on the Inside is one of many cards that deal with a cascade mechanic. And really, this card's here just to say, hey, play with Cascade maybe, if you're using this kind of deck. Cascade says that whenever you cast a spell that has Cascade, you then get to flip off the top of your deck until you hit a cheaper card. Bigger on the Inside lets you do that with one spell that you spend the specific mana Bigger on the Inside gives you. Then moving on from there, we also have Battle Mammoth. Battle Mammoth says whenever a permanent you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you may draw a card. That's nice, that's useful, helps you kind of benefit even though your things get removed, but the important thing here is the Foretell mechanic. The Foretell mechanic, like the Cascade mechanic, gets things out of the exile zone. What happens is you pay 2 colorless mana at one point and set your Foretell card aside face down so no one knows what it is. And then you can pay that more expensive price, in the case of Battle Mammoth, 2 colorless and 2 green mana, to cast it later. But that comes out of exile when you cast it then, which benefits off of Rocco and any other related benefits as well. It also helps spread out your mana, letting you be more efficient with your turns. What about another keyword? Another kind of older keyword that's really good is the Suspend mechanic. Suspend mechanic says you're going to pay that cheap cost and then you're going to put that many counters on the card and it's going to go into exile. Then at the start of your turn on your upkeep, you're going to start ticking that counter down, and when you take the last counter off, then you get to cast it from exile. That's very beneficial to you and to your game plan because, it lets you be more efficient with your mana, like Foretell, and also cast things from exile, like Foretell and like Cascade. Very beneficial from you. This card, Ecstatic Beauty, is especially beneficial because it also gives you more cards from exile to play, and if you're really leaning into that Suspend mechanic, it even helps suspend those other cards with Suspend. Another thing you can use is battles. Battles, or specifically sieges, have a transform to them, and when you transform them, you are casting them from exile. So this battle in particular is extra synergistic because it also exiles cards for you to play. Lets you exile all the cards from your hand, kind of like Memory Vessel, and then you draw that many new cards, and until the end of turn you can play the exiled cards. So it helps you kind of get rid of cards that you may want to play, but then you don't really care about outside of that, and get you a fresh hand. And then, when you manage to defeat the battle and flip it over, casting it transformed procs the Rocco trigger. But then you also have the backside, which still benefits from that exile synergy. It lets you discard a land card if you're kind of mid to late game and don't really need your lands. You can discard a land card to do 2 damage to any target. But whenever you do so, either from Pyre of the World Tree or from a different effect, you get to exile the top card of your library and you can play it that turn. So, more Rocco benefits off of the exile. Let's look at foods now. Foods are arguably the weakest of the clue, treasure, food trifecta of artifact tokens, but they're still really good, and they're still really good in this deck specifically. First card I want to look at is Nuka-Cola Vending Machine, which lets you make a food for 1 mana and tapping it, but more importantly, whenever you sacrifice a food for any reason, not just its own ability, you get to make a tapped treasure token. This benefits really well with the next card, which is Peregrine Took. Peregrine Took says if 1 or more tokens would be created under your control, those tokens plus an additional food are created instead. This means that whenever you create one of the tapped treasures with Nuka-Cola Vending Machine, a food comes with it. This gets into an infinite combo with Peregrine Took's second ability, which lets you sacrifice 3 foods to draw a card. So what happens here is that you have your 3 foods, you sacrifice them to draw a card. When you do, that's going to make 3 more treasures off of the vending machine, which, with 3 more treasures, you get 3 more foods off of Peregrine Took, which lets you sacrifice them to draw a card and keep going. This gets you as many cards as you want, as long as you have space left in your deck, and it also gets you tapped treasures as well, making it a very powerful way to get card advantage and mana advantage. Another card you might want to look at is Displaced Dinosaurs. This card can just straight up win the game if you use it properly. What happens is it lets all historic permanents enter the battlefield under your control as dinosaurs in addition to their other types, and 7/7 dinosaurs nonetheless. So that means any kind of food you're making, any kind of other artifact token like these tapped treasures from Nuka-Cola Vending Machine that you're making, even all your legendary creatures, they get to be large and 7/7 and dinosaurs. So this lets you build a very massive offensive board state for combat, whether it be you can use it for defense, but usually if you're getting this many 7/7s, you're just turning them sideways and killing people, making it a very powerful late game bomb to use to close out a game. Speaking of bombs to use to close out a game, you have Indomitable Creativity. This is useful not to target your opponent's stuff, as some people may think, but more commonly used to destroy your own stuff, to start looking through your deck and sifting through your deck to find what benefits you. Good news for you is that you make so many foods that you don't really have that much attachment to, that you can destroy as many of them as you have mana to destroy, and then you get to flip into your valuable non-token creatures and non-token artifacts like the 3 we just suggested. This card works really well with Party Thrasher, because if you get Indomitable Creativity in exile, then you can use the Convoke part of Party Thrasher that we talked about earlier to get it out for a higher cost, but cheaper for you. Another thing to use with Indomitable Creativity to help you benefit is cards like Knight of Sweet's Revenge, which lets your foods tap for mana. So you make these foods, you have these foods tap for mana, feed it into Indomitable Creativity or another source, and then sacrifice the foods if needed. It also makes a food token when it enters, and it also lets you close out a game in its own right, although not quite as easy as Displaced Dinosaurs. What you can do with it is you can sacrifice it, and then all your creatures get a stat bonus equal to the number of foods you control. This is only really for offensive, because it only lasts until end of turn. You have to do it on sorcery speed, but you can close out a game in a pinch with it. Another card you may want to use to close out a game and also to remove enemy threats is Rampage of the Clans. It's a 4-mana instant. The instant speed's very nice because you can use this card at an opponent's end step before the start of your turn, and then your payoffs will be ready to go. And that payoff is that it destroys all artifacts and enchantments, but the controllers get a 3/3 green centaur for each permanent destroyed this way. If you have 10 foods, now you have 10 3/3s. If you have 20 foods, you have 20 3/3s. And that's a game-ending board state often, especially because doing it at instant speed, you can do it right when you need it for attackers, for blockers, or for other reasons. Another card, the last card I want to look at when it comes to specifically foods, is Balin the Haymaker. Balin lets you tap these foods because often you're not paying them and tapping them to sacrifice them with the ability that comes on them. But they're kind of sitting there untapped and unused until you use them with one of these other cards I've mentioned. So Balin lets you make use of those earlier, lets you make mana off of it, lets you draw cards off of it, and lets you make Balin bigger as both a defensive and an offensive threat. So very nice and very useful. Foods has a lot more than just this. You can do a lot with artifact tokens and even a lot with foods. So now that we've looked at your synergy pieces, there's one other thing I kind of want to talk about before we look at some of the kind of fun ways you can build the deck as a whole and focus the deck towards a specific theme. And that's what kind of staples you use. This is mostly going to be removal spells, but there are other spells here, because there's a lot of cards over the years that kind of find their way into many decks, and they're staples, and they make decks feel a little samey, because of course every deck's going to have this card if it wants to do this, because it's just a good card. And because I'm such a big fan of the creativity behind playing Magic the Gathering, and the creativity behind Commander and the social format of Commander, that I think it's important to throw out some of those staples and to try to remain on theme instead. Make your removal spells, make your interaction more thematic instead of just more standard and generic. For example, you may have Day of Judgment or a similar board wipe, and while that's well and good, there are board wipe options that synergize better with Rocco. For example, get a board wipe that uses Foretell. Doomscar lets you pay 2 of the cost now and 3 of the cost later, but when you do so, it comes out of exile and gives you that benefit you're looking for in the deck. We also have Cathartic Reunion, that classic kind of red style of draw where you have to ditch a card first. What if instead you use Demand Answers, which lets you sacrifice an artifact instead of discarding, getting one of the foods that you may not really care that much for, and drawing 2 cards instead. You also have Rampant Growth and other kind of ramp spells. I encourage you to, when you can in all your decks, look for ramp spells that are specifically useful to your deck. For example, we have Return from the Wilds, which lets you, in addition to getting your land, put out a food if you want to, or even a human. creature token. It's whatever you kind of want or need. It may not be as mana efficient, but it's more on theme, and I think that's really important, especially because, unless you're playing CEDH, Commander's a social format. It's a format where you're there to have a good time and there to show off what you can do with your deck as much as you are to experience what others can do with their deck. So I think creativity sometimes takes precedent over efficiency. Also, we have spells like Path to exile target creatures. Instead of that one, where as a downside you have to give them a land, then maybe instead you run Dispatch. The downside here is that unless you have 3 artifacts out, all it does is tap them. But the benefit here is that you get 3 artifacts pretty easily because you make so many foods. So kind of an alternative upside downside, but one that you can kind of work around with because of the theme of your deck. But granted, there are staples. I'm not saying throw out all your staples. I'm just saying whatever you do, try to remain on theme. So for staples that do remain on theme, we have Tibalt's Trickery, the red counterspell, the iconic red counterspell really at this point. And the important part about here is that whatever spell they get off of Tibalt's Trickery comes out of exile, which is very beneficial for Rocco. We also have Jessica's Will, a very common red staple. This lets you exile the top 3 cards of your library and play them this turn. Right? Very in line with what Rocco wants to do, as well as giving you mana to use it and to do so. We also have Mosswort Bridge as a card. This hideaway mechanic does cast it from exile. But not only that, but Mosswort Bridge requires you to have creatures of power 10 or greater, and with all the 1/1 counters you're going to be putting on things, that's a pretty easy requirement to reach. So let's look at some of the ways to kind of focus your deck, to have a unique theme. That way, even if you come across another deck with the same commander, they feel different. One of the ways to play the deck is you can play it with a burn style. For example, you can use Passionate Archaeologist, which says whenever you cast a spell from exile, as long as your commander's out, you deal that much damage equal to its mana value to target opponent. Similarly, you have Quintorius Con, which says when you cast a spell from exile, each opponent takes 2 damage and you gain 2 life. We also have Shalayan Halar, which doesn't benefit off the exile, but rather the 1/1 counter side of things, and does damage to target opponent equal to the 1/1 counters put on any creature you control. Then you also have Hedron Detonator, which benefits off of the food side of the synergy pile, and that's whenever artifacts enter the battlefield under your control, you get to deal 1 damage to target opponent, and you also can sacrifice 2 artifacts, often foods in this deck, to exile the top card of your library and play it that turn, which, loops around with these other cards, so lets you kind of burn down those life totals really fast. A staple, really, of kind of burning things down with 1/1 counters is Walking Ballista, which you can start putting counters on with your Rocco and with the other cards we talked about earlier, and then you can remove them to do 1 damage not just to your opponent, but to any target. You can get some equipment on this, like a Basilisk Collar to give it Death Touch and Lifelink, and really just kind of go to town with it. Another card you might want to look for is Delayed Blast Fireball. This is a very common kind of card from this specific set. And one of the benefits of this is that you can cast it for 3 mana and do 2 damage to each opponent and their creatures. But if you do it for the Foretell cost, you can do 5. Now the thing is, with Rocco, you can bypass that Foretell cost. Because foretelling means you're going to have to pay 6 mana to get it out of exile. But if you put it into exile with something other than foretell, like let's say Rocco's trigger, or by tapping your Hedron Detonator or some other mechanic, then you can cast it for that 3 mana cost, that normal cheap cost, and still get the 5 damage out of it, which lets you be very efficient with your mana and synergizes very well with the deck. Last card I have for an example is Uncivil Unrest, which lets you take advantage of all those 1/1 counters going on things even if they don't care about 1/1 counters. Lets you double damage that would be dealt from your creatures, as long as there's a 1/1 counter on it, which really helps accelerate that burn game plan. Another theme you can use Rocco for is Group Hug. Now, I don't really like using it as Group Hug. I don't think it's amazing as Group Hug, but there are about 200 decks, according to EDH Rec, that do so. And so you can very much use it as a strategy. One of the cards you might want to put in is Glunch the Bestower, because Glunch the Bestower gives 1/1 counters on creatures, which helps with some of the other Rocco-related synergies. Expedited Inheritance encourages your other players at the table to play cards from exile by giving them the opportunity to exile cards whenever their creatures take damage. You also have Bigger on the Inside, which we did mention before, but the reason it's coming up again in this group hug context is because you can give that mana from Bigger on the Inside to any player, not just yourself. It gives them Cascade when that happens on their next spell, so you get to benefit off of that exile trigger. The Wedding of River Song is another group hug card. This one, instead of messing with Cascade, messes with Suspend, letting you and opponent each suspend a card, and when that comes off the suspend, there's your exile triggers for Rocco. Communal Brewing is a card that benefits off of 1/1 counters, letting you put counters on it from a group hug standpoint, and then all of your creatures are going to enter with that many more 1/1 counters. We also have Tempered Glory, which is another 1/1 counter related kind of card that works well with the group hug theme. Group hug, there's not really a lot of cards that specifically work with Rocco, but you can put a lot of generic group hug stuff in and then put these 6 or maybe some other cards you find in as well to make it work out. I don't necessarily recommend it. I think there's better ways to play Rocco and better ways to play group hug, but it is an option you can do if that's what you like, that's what your play group likes. And the last theme I want to talk about, and really this is the meanest theme, so warning, if your playgroup does not like getting salty over what's going on at the table, if your playgroup's really casual about how they play, or if you don't like being mean to other players, I would caution you against using this theme, against using some of these cards. 1 or 2 of them may fit. I have 1 or 2 of them in my deck. But really focusing on this is going to be dangerous if you don't have a play group that really appreciates it and really doesn't mind playing with it. And that's stacks. You can play Rocco stacks in really some fun ways. One way is by using Nil's Discipline Enforcer. Nil says that at the beginning of your end step, for each player you can put a 1/1 counter on a creature they control. This is nice. It's very similar to Rocco's ability to put 1/1 counters on target creatures even if they're not your own. The important part is that they can't attack you unless they pay a tax, where that tax is equal to the number of counters they have on the creature they're trying to swing at you with. This means that not only are they incentivized to swing at other people, that way they don't have to spend their mana, but you're also making their creatures bigger, that way they hit harder when they hit those other players. It's very nice and kind of taxy and stacksy. Speaking of taxy, we have Esper Sentinel, a very classic tax piece that lets you draw cards whenever your opponents cast their first non-creature spell. The fun part here is that the tax to prevent that is based off of Esper Sentinel's power. So if you put enough 1/1 counters on Esper Sentinel from Rocco or from other sources, then it becomes almost impossible for them to stop you from drawing cards. We also have Drannith Magistrate, one of the meanest, most hated cards in Commander because it keeps you from casting any card from anywhere other than your hand. This includes your commander, but importantly for you, it includes cards from exile. That means when Rocco or other cards are putting things your opponents control into exile, they're not coming back out while Drannith Magistrate's on the field. And most of those exile effects also are time limited, right? Rocco only lasts until your next end step. So if you can keep Drannith Magistrate out long enough, they just lose those cards forever. Also stops their commander, right? Very mean card, but it is very synergistic with a stack-style gameplay. You also have Aven Interrupter, one of 2 birds that I use in my deck for kind of a stacks or tax theme. Aven Interrupter, you can flash it in to delay someone else's spell by exiling it and making it plotted. And then spells that get cast from graveyards or exile cost 2 more. This is important because now they're going to have to pay extra for anything they get off of Rocco or a different trigger. And even more importantly, it kind of shuts down some graveyard decks. It also makes Cascade decks a lot more miserable to play, because Cascade's fun and good because whatever card you get off of Cascade is free. If you start having to pay 2 mana for it, then you're going to really start to hurt a good bit, because you either lose those cards forever or you have to pay extra, which means you have less mana to do other things with. The other mean bird I like to put in my deck is Aerial Extortionist. Aerial Extortionist lets you exile non-land permanents that players control. They can cast it again. They will have to pay for it if they do so, though. And then whenever something comes out of exile, whenever another player, so it doesn't count you, cast a spell from anywhere other than their hand, you get to draw a card. So it gives you card advantage. It puts things your opponents like, because they already have them out, into exile. And if they want them back again, you're going to have to draw a card. Or you can use some of the previous mentioned cards to keep them from getting it back at all. We also have Kutsil, Malamet Exemplar. This works well with 1/1 counters. It's one of kind of a increasingly large package of cards that prevents opponents from doing things on your turn. Important here is that if your creature's power toughness is great, or not power toughness, but just power, is greater than its base power, you get to draw a card when it does combat damage to a player. 1/1 counters make things bigger than their base power, so it's a nice simple synergy to use. And the last stacks card I want to look at is a much older card, and this is a fun mechanic you can kind of use. Meekstone says creatures with power 3 or greater don't untap during their controller's untap steps. So if you're using Rocco and Nils and maybe some other cards and giving your opponents 1/1 counters on stuff, you can prevent them from untapping if their power gets large enough. Right? A lot of things that people like to use already have more than 3 power, but if they have less, you can change that. They may have a Llanowar Elf that taps for 1 mana. If you make it a 3/3 Llanowar Elf instead of a 1/1, then it's not untapping to do anything. Right? Very nice, very useful, very stacksy, taxy. Right? But I would, once again, if you're going to do this theme, I would caution you to be careful that you're not going to get taken out back and beat up. Right? But let's close out then. Why don't we? Rocco Street Chef is my favorite commander. It leads my favorite deck, although I do really like a large variety of decks and playstyles. And one of the reasons I really do like Rocco, and I think I've shown this, is because you can build him a variety of different ways. There are often cards coming out that you can add and remove from Rocco as new sets come out. And so it's a deck that constantly evolves. If you move or join different play groups, it's easy to adjust Rocco by adding and removing different cards to fit the different needs, the different enjoyments of you as you grow and of your play group and the people you play with as they grow and change. And because of that creativity that you can have, really, while I did kind of subtitle this deck, this commander, Rocco Street Chef, let him cook, maybe it's about letting you cook, right? Maybe it's about letting you cook.